Hello everyone, my name is Chris Sewell, a developer on AiiDA, and in this tutorial I'll be taking you through how to install AiiDA on your local machine. To do this, I will walk through the installation on a clean Linux environment. We'll look at setting up a Python virtual environment, setting up the services that AiiDA requires to run, and finally how to use JupyterLab with AiiDA. I'll now switch to my Virtual Studio Code environment and walk you through the demonstration. So firstly, what we want to do is set up a Python virtual environment to run AiiDA in. Setting up a virtual environment for any Python project really is important to do because it helps to keep the environment stable and correct, and all of the dependencies, so all the dependencies don't change. So for this, in this demonstration, we're going to use Python virtual environment, VMenv, and it's the simplest way to achieve this. Another way to do this is to use Conda, which is another package management system, which additionally allows you to install non-Python packages like Postgres, Rabbitmq, and even the simulation codes you want to run if you wanted to run them locally. So to do this, we'll first initialize our virtual environment. And you see here, this has created our virtual environment folder here, and it contains our AiiDA virtual environment with all of the Python packages, the initial Python packages, and then the Python packages we will later install. So that's done, and now whenever we want to use this environment, we need to activate it. So we can do that using this activation script. So you see here, we're now inside our AiiDA environment. And if we list the packages, you see we just have the initial two. We want to update them and also include will, which is another package useful for installing and building our dependencies. So once they have updated, we can then install AiiDA core itself. So now that we have installed our Python dependencies into our environment, we can list these, and we shall see that we have in fact got AiiDA core and all of its dependencies. We can also use pip check to check that all the dependencies are compatible with one another in case we download or install a dependency later on. You may find the first time you run Verdi that it errors, or if you install a new AiiDA plugin. And this is because you need to run re-entry scan, which just updates all of the links for the AiiDA plugins. So if we run that, now if we run Verdi, we should see we now have that available to us. And if we run Verdi status, we'll see that it's working, but there's no profile configured yet. You'll also note that by default, the configuration file will be obtained from your home directory under .aida. If you might be working on multiple AiiDA projects, or you want to configure this better, you can use the AiiDA path environmental variable. So for instance here, we'll export the AiiDA path And now when we do Verdi status, you'll see that the configuration directory is set up to our local folder, and you can see here that it's created the folder with the initial configuration. To add tab completion for the Verdi command line interface, we can run this command, and then when you type Verdi, you can press tab and it will give you all of the commands, and it will do that for nested commands. So what we want to do now is set up our profile. To do this, we actually need to, it's helpful, in fact, to understand the microservices that AiiDA uses. So we've set up our virtual environment. We have our AiiDA core Python environment. Now, AiiDA also uses Postgres as the database to store information. And then Rabbitmq is used to facilitate storing while processes are running and communicate with the processes. So to set up our profile, we first need to set up Postgres and install it and tell AiiDA Core how to connect to it. Now, this does not necessarily have to be on your local computer. You could have this on a separate compute resource anywhere, as long as it can connect to it via TCP. But for this tutorial, we'll set it up locally. So on Linux, we want to use the apt installation manager. So we'll first update that to make sure it has access to all of the up-to-date packages. Then we'll install these packages required for Postgres and Rabbitmq. So now we've done that, we quickly need to run this command just for this development environment. You shouldn't need that locally. Then we want to set up the database cluster that AiiDA will connect to. So when we do that, and I've set it up in this folder, you see there's now a database folder where Postgres keeps all of its data. And then we want to, when that is initialized, we want to start the database and have it serving over a port. So when we do this, and you'll see here in this development container that it's now serving over port 5432, and that's where AiiDA will connect to it. So now we have our database running. We can use Verdi quick setup, can find that database, and then create the necessary database that AiiDA needs to use and create our profile. So if we want Verdi quick setup, we can just use the automated profile name. We can do a email address to distinguish ourselves as a user. And then once we've entered that initial information, as we already have our database set up and running, AiiDA will be able to find that and then create the database and set up the database that it needs for its profile. So once that's done, again, we can go back to Verdi status, and we should hopefully see that we now have a number of ticks under the different parts. We haven't yet set up Rabbitmq obviously yet, and you can see here we have our profile, we have our repository for where we store files, and we have connected to Postgres. And if we run Verdi profile show, for the profile we've set up, we can see all of the different connection details there. We can do Verdi config list, which will show us all of the settings, which can also be changed by Verdi config for our profile. And if we run the database summary, you'll see initially we just have our single user, no nodes or groups or any other entities. Alternatively, as you see, we went through and did that interactively. You can also, with Verdi Quick Setup, you can enter in all of the information manually, or you can also use a YAML file to store it, and then we simply pass it the YAML file with all of this information already in there. And you'll see here, then that will set that up. And once that's done, if we list the profiles, you'll see we've created a new profile, AiiDA, although our original profile, Quick Setup, will still be the default this time. So you can, when you run Verdi, you can do Verdi -P and you can do the name of the profile, or you can reset the default profile. So now we have all our database set up, and we have, so it has a means to store all our data. We also want the means of how to run all our processes, and to do that we use Rabbitmq. So we've already installed it in one of the previous steps, so we just need to start that running as well. And now that's running, again we will go back to Verdi status, and we'll see now that Rabbitmq should be running. And then we finally want to start our daemon services, which are processes that run in the background, and you can choose as many as you like with the number, but you shouldn't choose more than the processes on the actual machine that you're using. So if we run that, we'll start the services, and when we go back to Verdi status, we should be all fully good to go. And you can also, to look at the specific daemon instances running, daemon processes, you can use Verdi daemon status. So that's how we get started with AiiDA. That's the full setup. We've set up the Python environment, we've set up the database environment, Rabbitmq, and we've set up a full profile with all of the ways to connect to that. Now, you might want to start with some existing data in Verdi archive that you may have seen about before. So we can, for instance, import a URL or a local file. So this will download that archive, migrate it to the latest version that this particular version of AiiDA Core requires, if that's necessary, and then import it into our database. And now when we do Verdi database summary, once we've waited for it to fully load, we should see we have all of the nodes and processes and groups that archive contains. So we can see the summary there of what the archive was, and then we can come back to that with Verdi database summary, which should now give us all of the users, computers, nodes, etc. And as you can see there, we have two groups, and if we list them, we can see what they are. And then perhaps we want to, once we've added some extra data and run some extra processes, we might want to create our own archive. So we can do that by specifying a particular group or node or computer or code. And then that will export all of that data into an archive that you can share with others, with your group or collaborators. And if we inspect that archive, we can see what's inside it, what the format is and what the AiiDA version is. So finally, I just want to touch on how to use Jupyter Lab. So this won't be installed with AiiDA Core. We can simply install that afterwards. And as you may have seen already, within Jupyter Notebooks and Jupyter Lab, we can use the AiiDA magic to initialize, tell Jupyter about our database and initialize AiiDA. To do that, we need to add this small script here into the IPython Jupyter defaults. So once this is installed, we're going to import that, and then once we start Jupyter Lab, you should see that come up. Okay, so now that Jupyter Lab is installed and its dependencies, we can create a folder and we can copy this magic registration script into the correct place. And now when we start Jupyter Lab, we should be able to connect to it. We'll open in a browser. We just need to get the token here from which to connect to. And if I move this over to here, you'll see that if we connect to our example.ipython notebook, we can run our AiiDA magic, and that will start up our database. We have the status that we can run, and we can start using the API. So we do our query builder and we get 262, and that's simply how you start Jupyter and Jupyter Lab and get working on there. So thank you. I hope this tutorial is helpful to you and setting up your AiiDA environment, and happy AiiDAing.